Good morning, everyone. Hope your Saturday is off to a good start. Thank you for joining us for part of it. My name is Amber Stinger, and I am president of the League of Women Voters of Johnson County. The League is proud to be nonpartisan, neither supporting nor opposing candidates or political parties at any level of government. Today, we continue our efforts to educate and engage voters, one of the primary reasons the League was founded more than 100 years ago. With the increased focus on all of the weather-related catastrophes throughout the world, wildfires, extreme temperatures, droughts, and floods, more people are finally waking up to the reality of the climate crisis and paying more attention to our precious resources like water. That's why we are grateful to our esteemed panelists today for taking the time to share their knowledge and expertise with us. Here's our plan for today. In the first hour, our panelists will discuss the state of water in Kansas and how we can preserve and protect our resources. Following that, they will take some of your questions. Then we'll move it right into a few updates and we'll end the event with a few organizational announcements. To help our event run smoothly, we want to go over a few things. First, please use the chat box to ask questions. We've set the chat options so that only the panelists will see your questions and comments. Click on the chat icon and your controls at the bottom of the screen to get the chat box to appear. Once the panel discussion begins, we recommend you watch the program in gallery view. You can switch the layout on your screen by clicking view in the top right corner and selecting gallery. Also, the program will be recorded and posted to our YouTube channel in the next few days. Now, I'm delighted to introduce Janet Milkovich, our Vice President, and the person who is responsible for putting this program together and for the many other amazing programs we've provided this year. So Janet, thank you. And now I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Amber. Good morning, everybody. It's so nice to be here. And it's my great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Representative Lindsay Vaughn. There she is. Good morning, Representative Vaughn. Representative Vaughn is the ranking minority leader on the House Committee on Water and the youngest female member of the Kansas House. She grew up here in Overland Park and represents House District 22. Representative Vaughn has been a community organizer for young citizens and believes that we can create real change by connecting with each other around issues we care about, water being one of those. Representative Vaughn, thank you for your work on water. I'll now turn the program over to you.
Thank you, Janet, for the kind introduction, and good morning, everybody. I'm very excited to be here to talk about one of my very favorite policy issues, and I'm particularly excited about it for one of the reasons Janet mentioned, which I feel is that, this is a bipartisan issue, and we can come together and really create positive change to improve water management and protection in Kansas. So those are some of the things we'll be talking about today with our phenomenal panelists. But first, I think many of us take water for granted. I know I certainly did before joining the House Water Committee. And so, some of the things we'll touch on. Have you ever wondered where the water comes from in our county before? Or have you ever wondered how water is funded in Kansas? Those sorts of questions. And I'm really excited to be here because the League has offered to host this wonderful event because the issue of water is very important to League members. The League supports protecting public health and promoting economic development through a cooperative framework by which legally appropriate water entities provide Johnson County residents with safe drinking water, wastewater handling, and stormwater management while safeguarding the environment. So without further ado, our panelists today are well versed in the current state of water in Kansas and will address all of the water challenges that currently exist, as well as possible solutions. I've been very lucky to work with the panelists today, and I'm honored to introduce them. So our first panelist is Dawn Buehler. And Dawn is the Kansas Riverkeeper and Executive Director of Friends of the Kaw and Chair of the Kansas Water Authority. Dawn monitors, responds, and mediates suspected pollution incidents on the Kansas River. It's also really exciting that she was recently a recipient of the 2001 Climate and Energy Award from the CEP. So welcome, Dawn, and thank you so much for being here. And then our second panelist is someone that I have worked very closely with and have the honor of introducing. It is State Representative Ron Highland, who is the chairman of the House Water Committee. He's also a doctor of veterinary medicine and was elected to the Kansas House in 2012. Representative Highland grew up in Western Kansas and has always been aware of the importance of water. He endorses a robust water education campaign for the public, which is very much a part of what we've been doing. So excited to have you here, Chairman Highland. And then last, and certainly not least, we have Connie Owen, who has been practicing Kansas water law for 28 years, serving as legal counsel for the Division of Water Resources at the Kansas Department of Agriculture, and is also as a presiding as a hearing officer over administrative hearings related to water rights. Connie is currently the executive director of the Kansas Water Office. So now, before we dive in, we thought it would be fun to cover some basic water facts. And here is where I'm going to ask for a little bit of audience participation to get us going early on this Saturday morning. So first, one thing that we've been doing this past session is really learning about all of the different water agencies, their functions, and everything they do to support water management and protection in Kansas. So that's been a very big job because of how many agencies there are. So the first question that I want to throw into the chat box is, how many state agencies do you think deal with water in Kansas? So if you just want to type a number into the chat box, we'll just see if we can get a few responses and see if someone can come close here. All right, Marcia says 15. That is almost on the money. That's very close. Oh, Chris, yep, okay. We have a lot of good guesses. 57, 18, 20, 15. You guys are great. There are so many, yes, 23, 9. Thank you so much for your participation. This is wonderful. So there are actually 16 state agencies that deal with Kansas, and then there are 7 federal agencies that deal with water as well at the state level. So a lot of different agencies and offices involved, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we get going. And then I do have one more audience participation question, and that is, how do we get our water in Kansas? You guys know the water sources in Johnson County. And I'll give you a hint that there are 3 of them. So there should be 3 water sources. What do we think? Yeah, we got the river, very good. Surface water and wells, okay, yeah. Rivers. Very good, you guys are on it. I'm so excited. You seem very informed about this issue. So in Johnson County, we receive our water from the Kansas River, the Missouri River, and then surrounding wells. So we're very blessed in northeastern Kansas to have access to such great rivers for our water sources. Surface water over here. All right. That was great. Thank you guys for participating. So to just give you a little bit more context before we kick things off, in terms of what these agencies that we've been talking about do, one of those agencies that Connie is the executive director of is the Water Office, and they're the key policy making or policy recommending and communications body of water in Kansas. So they inventory existing water resources, identify problems with water, and forecast future needs, including the preservation of aquifers and improving water quality. And then the other key agencies involved there, KDHE does a lot of water quality initiatives, and then we have the Department of Agriculture, where the the Division of Water Resources is, and they see a lot of the water quantity in Kansas. So we'll get into all of that today too. And then there is the legislative aspect of this as well. And 1 year ago, the House established a committee on water, which is what Chairman Highland presides over as the chair of that committee, and then I'm the ranking member of that committee as well. And Representative Orr from Western Kansas is our vice chair. And our committee is charged with understanding and addressing the concerns of water and recommending a plan going into our second session here about how we want to address water issues in Kansas. So that's going to be a very big issue going to this upcoming session, and part of why it's so wonderful that the league is hosting this event, because we would love constituent input as we start to address water issues and really talk about how we can fix water for the future of Kansas. So with all of those facts in mind and as a jumping off point, we'll go ahead and start the first part of our panel, which will address water challenges in Kansas. So we're going to start by just kind of opening it up with a broad question. What are some of the most important issues involving water in Kansas? And so I'll just open this up to all panelists. Is Kansas in a water crisis currently, do you think?
From the perspective of the water committee, we've looked at, it's a huge undertaking and maybe the second most difficult job I've been assigned since I've been in the legislature. And we looked at this, and to get a good understanding, we had to first identify all the players in the field. So we gathered during our session 200 megabytes of information. And if you look that up, 1 megabyte equals about 1,000 pages. So we ended up with several pages of information to look at and to study. And with that, we now have a better understanding of the overall, everything associated with water in Kansas. And then next we move to having the committee understand it even further by taking them to Western Kansas, to Garden City, for a full committee meeting out there. And we visited technical farms. We visited the uranium removal process in Lake in Kansas. And so we now plan in January when we get back, I think Lindsay has arranged for us to visit Water One. And so that the committee will see everything from Western Kansas all the way to an urban setting and how that water is distributed. So it's a big deal. And I'm very fortunate to have Lindsay as the ranking member. She's very interested and she keeps me on my toes. So with that, we'll try to answer as many questions as she throws out there today. And secondly, I want to thank the group for inviting me. I consider it an honor to visit and talk about something that is very close to everybody's heart, and we will get into it in detail. Thank you.
Wonderful. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. And that's also a nice segue. Connie and Dawn, do you want to say a few words before we really get into the nitty-gritty of all the questions?
I think I might, and then I'll kick it over to Dawn.
Okay.
And the question, first off, again, thank you very much, League of Women Voters. This is the more visibility we can give water issues, the better, because as we've all been talking about, these are things that most people don't think about, but actually right now there's a lot at risk. And the question of, is there a water crisis? Yes and no. There's not one single water crisis. There are a number of them. So that's the yes. I'll let Dawn talk a little more about the surface waters. That's really her domain, much more than mine. But just to throw out the issue of groundwater in Western Kansas, and we can get into more detail a little bit later, but you may have heard of the Ogallala Aquifer that is being depleted. It's being mined, and that's not to put any kind of negative ill intent on that. It's just there's been more use of the aquifer than is naturally recharging. So it's just dropping over time and has been, and is to the point where real change needs to happen with how water is used so that the economy of Western Kansas can remain vibrant. And we can, go into a little more specifics about that. But in terms of the supply in Western Kansas, very much a crisis. And water quality also is an issue, both with surface waters and with groundwaters. Some of that quality issue is naturally occurring. There are some chemicals in the geologic formations that occurs naturally, but over time and with different kinds of use patterns can be aggravated. And there are some that are not naturally occurring, and we have to try and address those as well. So with that little brief overview regarding groundwater, I'll pass it over to you, Dawn.
Thank you, Connie. Thank you as well to the League for this opportunity to come here today and talk about water. I agree with Connie. The best way that we can elevate the conversation about water is to have forums such as this where more people can learn. Kind of the pathway is to educate ourselves, to learn how to advocate, and then to act. And so today, I'm hopeful that all of you will learn a little bit about each of those. Are we in a water crisis? Yeah, we are, but the water crisis is across the entire world. It is significant in Kansas too. It's being also exacerbated by climate change. We're in a climate crisis. And so when we look at the eastern side of the state, yes, we get a lot more rain. We have a lot more opportunities for water, but we've got some really big issues. In 2019, we had the great flood of the Midwest. The Kansas River that runs through eastern Kansas was high for the entire year at flood stage, and our reservoirs were full. And along with them getting full of water, they also, because of the way that the watershed works and water runs off the landscape, they fill in with sediment. And we saw in 2019 that Tuttle Creek Reservoir, which is a major source of flood control and drinking water downstream, that reservoir filled in, I think, 8% in 1 year. And it's filling in fast. And we know that there's a lifespan on those, but we also need to do some things now to protect our drinking water supply downstream of the reservoirs, and also our ability to hold floodwaters in times of flood. So there are a lot of things happening on this side of the state that have to do with that water quantity part as well. But we also have a water quality issue. There's a lot of things happening in our watershed. You know, watershed management starts at the very top of the watershed. We have to work on ways to protect our drinking water supply with land use practices. So there's a lot of things that we can do, but we are in a crisis mode. And I do believe that elevating the conversation will help us solve some of these problems in Kansas. So thanks for the question, Lindsay.
And to delve into that a little bit more, you talk about the different issues related to quantity, both with the aquifer and the reservoirs, and then quality. And you mentioned non-point source pollution and, you know, the source of potential pollutants for watersheds. And, you know, would you maybe want to talk a little bit more about the sources of those things? You know, what's causing depletion of the aquifer and what's causing sedimentation of our reservoirs? And then what are some of the things that are causing the major water quality issues in Kansas? And I will kick it over to either Representative Highland or Connie. Do you want to take that one?
The major points have been brought up. We have to go back in history a little bit. And we're not going to apply blame to anyone, because at the time, nobody understood the true nature of water and how we received it and all that. We thought it was there forever. So we're not going to apply any blame. But so water was over allocated in Western Kansas, allowed too many wells to be dug. Okay, now on this end of the state, the dams were built with a lifespan of approximately 50 years. And as you know, we're past that date. And so the solution there is twofold. One is to build another dam upstream, and the chances of that are between nil and none. And so we have to deal with the situation at hand. So desilting the dams is probably the next major solution. And the silting comes from runoff from the lands, the farming upstream. We understand that. So we have to deal with, and we have agencies that are dealing with that. They're helping the farmers change their practices of farming, or putting in watershed areas that will collect that before it ever gets to the streams. So those things are going on now, but we do need to intensify those efforts. And so with that, the desilting, we'll get into it in more detail a little later. I'm sure Connie has some thoughts on that, and then that'll lead us to another discussion, and that's funding. So we'll get there, but it'll take a little bit.
So if I may chime in a little bit to further point out what Representative Highland says is entirely true. In terms of with Western Kansas, with the depleting aquifer, how did we get there? with the progress of knowledge sometimes is uneven. And at the point at which technology in the 1950s, 60s realized that there was a way to access the Ogallala Aquifer to irrigate agriculture in Western Kansas, when that became readily available, then of course, let's do it, right? Everybody thought there's plenty of water down there. Let's get some, let's really capitalize on this ability to produce more food, more irrigated agriculture and livestock and the food that they rely on. And the use of the aquifer skyrocketed with production agriculture, with full-scale center pivot irrigation. At the time, as Representative Highland said, the state of the art with the knowledge of the aquifer was not such that we understood the actual lifespan of what was going on and what we needed to think in terms of this is not forever. So complicating this strategy, this whole situation, and I don't want to go off on too much of a tangent and dominate the conversation, but the system of water rights in Kansas is complicating this tremendously, because in Kansas, we have a permit system. And just really, really briefly, if other than a domestic use for water, like if you put in a well to serve your own home, you don't need to have a permit to do that. But pretty much everything else, you need to have a permit through one of the state agencies, which is the Division of Water Resources, which is within the Department of Agriculture. They determine, do you get a permit? Is there enough to go around? Will you hurt anybody else if you put your well where you want to put it? Those kind of things. So you get a permit, you use your water, you comply with your permit rules, and over time, under circumstances, it becomes a full water right. It becomes a property right. So when we look at over time, a lot of these property rights have been developed in a way that we now know allows, in theory, for more water to be taken out than water is there, than can sustain that supply. So that really complicates the issue and how to address it. But we've learned over time that we do have to address it, that depletion is real. There are some areas in Western Kansas now that are actually economically dry, that there's no, it's not cost effective to try to pump, right? You have to go down so far and the water quality is not good and whatnot. There are some areas now that have been determined there's maybe 20 years left, maybe 30 years left. And so the challenge is how to deal with this going forward, when we know if we don't do something differently, then this is not going to end well. And fortunately, there are activities and there are strategies and there are practices that are being implemented now that show a lot of promise in addressing that issue. But how did we get here? It was, as I said, it was kind of an uneven level of knowledge, and we cannot assign blame to anyone in particular or any particular policy. It was just, decisions were made based on the information they had at the time. And now we have to contend with a resource that won't support all of the property rights that are associated with it. So hopefully I didn't go off too much on that.
I think you gave a great overview of a lot of the topics that we're really going to delve into. In particular, some of the trends of depletion, the future of Western Kansas, and then really maybe talking a little bit more about water rights. So I thought that was great. And I think I'm going to kick it over to Dawn. Dawn, do you think these trends in water depletion can be slowed? And, can we talk a little bit about water or aquifer recharge? Is there any opportunity for replenishing the waters that have been depleted?
Thank you, Rep. Vaughn. Yes, there are lots of opportunities. And frankly, the Kansas Water Office. And Connie, I think you've got a copy of the annual report in front of you. If any of you are interested in reading it, there'll be a new annual report that comes out for 2022. And this is from the Kansas Water Authority. And this document kind of goes over all those programs. And there are some really great programs in there that work with lots of different landowners and on programs that can help recharge the aquifer. And one of them is the LEMA, the Local Enhanced Management Area. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I won't dive into a lot of detail, but it is proven to be successful in parts of Western Kansas. And there have been several of those programs put into place that have had success. They've shown not only do they reduce the amount of water coming out of the aquifer and slow down that process, but actually farmers and ranchers are making more money doing it. So they're not having as many inputs and they're not having as many costs associated with it. So the Water Office and all the other agencies are working on programs that not only make it better for our natural resources, but also make it better as an economic driver. I would like to say also that one of the things that we can do to work on recharging not only our aquifers, but along our rivers, we have alluvial aquifers that run along the sides of our rivers. And those are critical to drinking water supplies. For example, the city of Olathe has water that they pump from the Kansas River alluvial aquifer. But when we slow down water and allow it to infiltrate and not be so flashy and come off the landscape so fast. And so putting in lots of green infrastructure, I think, is really important to the future, especially of our cities, to slow down this water and allow it to infiltrate so that we keep the water here in Kansas in our aquifers instead of letting it run off down the river to the Gulf of Mexico. So those are some things that we could do as well.
Thank you so much, Dawn. And as we've talked about this issue in committee, one thing that we've become aware of is without these conservation efforts or methods, recharge is relatively negligible, especially in some of the most western parts of the state, but kind of across the state in general. So if we don't do proactive measures in order to really promote recharge and replenishment, are parts of the state at risk of, their habitability and their way of life? And I'll open that one up to whoever would be interested in answering.
You hit the nail right on the head. Conservation will have to be a key element of moving forward to deal with this problem we have in our state. And that includes the entire state. As mentioned by Dawn, we have the water that's being pumped out of the alluvial areas. But out west, if we don't institute some conservation measures, and some of it's being done voluntarily, but we need to help that process to move along more quickly. And in some cases, we will have to maybe do some cost sharing on the technical farm ideas. And as Dawn mentioned in the LEMAs, they are having great results. Our overall goal here is to stop that drop in the aquifers. That's number one. And then we need to develop plans for recharge. And then along the rivers, we need to get a handle on how much water is being pumped and maybe conserve some of that so that we do not deplete that resource. Cities and businesses are relying on it. My worry too is economically, we could cripple our state if we don't get a handle on this and move forward as quickly as possible. So that's our goal as a committee, and we've been working diligently on that. And it turned into an all-year job instead of a partial job. So we've been busy, and we look forward to the entire committee process in January and the ideas that will come forth from all the members. But we will be coming in loaded for bear. We've been working all year, so we have a lot of information to share with the committee when we meet. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And I might dive into that just a little bit. Just to give the audience a perspective on a timeline here, if we don't begin conservation efforts in Western Kansas, what's the timeline on the saturated thickness of the remaining aquifer? How many years left of groundwater do we have? Or in the reservoirs, based on the levels of sedimentation, Do you guys, and this is a bonus question, but just kind of wanting to dive in here, based on the sedimentation in the reservoirs, do we have any estimates about how much time we have left to utilize that remaining use in the future of those reservoirs?
That's Connie's.
And apologize if I'm putting you guys on the spot. This is something I'm interested in here.
That's okay. That's why we at the water office prepare annual reports and a water plan, and we have all that kind of information. Working together with other state agencies, Health and Environment and the Division of Water Resources, which has a tremendous database of water use, and the Kansas Geological Survey, we have some wonderful informational resources to try to manage these issues. And in your questions about the reservoirs, the remaining usable life of the reservoirs, Tuttle Creek, which as Dawn was referring to, it is projected to be down to 8% capacity by 2074. It is currently at about 48% capacity. And other reservoirs along the Kansas basin are facing the same problem, not as critical. Milford is projected to be at 83% and Perry at 49%, Clinton at 73%. That's if nothing is changing. And right now they're in different stages of depletion. Tuttle's is really pretty critical. Tuttle's is under half. With the remaining usable life of the aquifer, and we talk about that, I'll just kind of side note for a minute. We talk about the Ogallala Aquifer. It is not a single underground lake. It is a massive geologic formation from Canada down almost to Mexico. And there are many different, if you can imagine like a sponge, different pockets and different depths of water availability. So it's a little bit different from area to area, but in Western Kansas, it is depleting, and there really isn't any current serious scientific concept for bringing it back. The problem now is being turned and phrased in terms of conserving and extending the life of the Ogallala Aquifer in Western Kansas. In central and south central Kansas, there's a portion of the Ogallala that's the Equus Beds Aquifer that is around the Wichita area. It has very different properties. It can deplete and recharge much more quickly than the aquifer, the portion in Western Kansas. So when we're talking about aquifer depletion, it does vary from place to place in terms of the characteristics of it. But one thing that the Kansas Geological Survey has determined is for Southwest Kansas, and this is the most, one of the most critical areas because it has the highest density, it's of the irrigated agriculture, and that's not to lay blame, that's their economy. In order to reach, to hold steady at the rate of decline, not to make it sustainable, but to hold steady at the rate of decline, the use needs to drop by 33%, which is pretty dramatic. If in the abstract, as a citizen of Johnson County, you might think, oh, those are just numbers. But when you're looking at people whose livelihoods depend on the agriculture and feeding their livestock and running dairies and things like that, that's a big drop. But what has been referred to here before, there are programs, there are practices and activities that our office and other agencies are designing and encouraging to reduce the use of groundwater and really improve profitability. It needs to be much more widespread than it is, but our office has a program called the Water Technology Farms, which Representative Highland just mentioned, where we do financial support for farmers to adopt new practices and new technologies, such as their actual irrigation operation. The equipment they use puts water right on the plant. It's not spraying it up into the air so that it can evaporate. They have soil moisture probes, and this is really pretty amazing technology. Farmers can run their operations largely from their cell phones because they have probes in the ground that tell them what's your moisture level, what actually is it in the soil, do you need to water today, do you not? So instead of past practices where they just say, okay, we better, turn it on today, we don't know if it's going to rain tomorrow, they can actually determine, do I need to turn it on? And they're finding out a lot of times the answer is no, we really don't need to. We can hold off. And it's turning into a more profitable situation for them. As Dawn was saying, it costs less to for the inputs, the nutrients, the fertilizers and the seed costs and the energy costs to run those pumps and run those pivots. So we are facing a crisis. Some of these areas, like I said, they're done. Their wells are already dry. And there are some that the projected lifespan under the Kansas Geological Survey studies, maybe they're 20 years, maybe they're 50. But these numbers are really frightening. And I think it's time that we really take this seriously. And I'm super, super glad that there are programs like this one today to raise the awareness of this.
Yeah, thank you, Connie, for that overview. That was a really comprehensive, excellent answer to that. And, I asked that because during our interim meeting when we were in Garden City, one of the things I was most struck by was one of the farmers who was talking about his personal conservation efforts, but, it was almost in a way of panic. And he said, some of us are quite literally running out of water. And I don't know what else we need to know in order to start taking action. So I think, people are very aware of this and it's very present in their lives. And it's important that we start thinking about the imminent threat that this will cause to our economy and our farmers and our state in general, and talking about potential solutions, which is what we'll get to in the second part of this program. But first, I would love to ask just a couple more questions and to take a little bit of a turn. So not directly related to quality and quantity, but we do have some interest too in unequal access to water. So, are there challenges regionally with the unequal access to water? And we had a reference specifically to, say, the Kickapoo tribe as an example of this. And I wonder, Dawn, is that something that you might have some information about, or other panelists who want to jump in there?
I think this is a huge challenge. And I see it from my perspective, and I'm going to let Director Owen probably talk about the tribes. I don't have a lot of experience working with Kickapoo specifically, but what I've seen is this inequity that happens up and down. And you all know I primarily work on the Kansas River, and we have communities that have really old drinking water systems and wastewater treatment systems. So we're talking about infrastructure, and they're not able to discharge to the waterways at the levels, at the clean levels they're supposed to. And so some of those communities have had to have consent decrees to upgrade their systems, or they try to upgrade their systems, but it always comes back to cost. It's so expensive. This infrastructure is so expensive. And so some of the older cities along our river, some of them, they have old pipes that are made out of brick. And they'll try and find ways to improve that infrastructure, but the cost ends up being so high. And when your median household income is only $35,000 a year, and you're trying to upgrade these water systems, those costs historically they get passed on to the consumer, and we're talking about a consumer that can't afford it. And so how do we find ways to keep our systems upgraded and our water systems so that we're pushing out the cleanest water to the next downstream user without harming people who have the hardest time with it. So I think there's a lot of struggles in that infrastructure piece, which I know the Water Office doesn't specifically work on that, but Kansas Department of Health and Environment does. And they're a big part of the conversation about how do we get some of those systems upgraded.
If I may,
and-
Lindsay,
yeah, of course, Mr. Chair, go ahead.
the Kickapoo Nation was brought up, and I called Representative Laturner's office in DC and asked about where that bill is. Well, the original bill that was submitted by former Representative Watkins and Moran died. It passed its lifespan. So there is no bill currently to deal with that. It's complicated because we have an agreement with Kickapoo tribe in Kansas, but those agreements, because it is a sovereign nation, we have to have approval of Congress. So I have challenged them to come up with another bill and introduce it and get going on that again. Now, further on the topics that Don talked about, we in the committee are acutely aware of this, and the funding is a big deal. And we became acutely aware of it not only because of the infrastructure problem, but looking to Western Kansas, for example, in Lakin, Kansas, because of the uranium that's been discovered in the water out there. And the amount of money, it was $6 million for that small town to put in a filtration system for uranium. And it's now been discovered that uranium is being found in the water supplies in Northwest Kansas. So what we do know is that the groundwater is being contaminated, and also because of the lowering of the water levels, uranium is leaching out also from just unnatural formations down below. So now the next town over, Deerfield, a town of 300, has discovered they have uranium. Well, Lakin is kicking in and they're helping them. They will be shipping water over to that small town. But the next town in line is Garden City, which will be a big deal. But because we know that we have aging infrastructure all over the state, and the life of some of these small towns and the life of Western Kansas can be at stake if we don't do something about this. And it all comes down to money. So the funding comes up at this point. So what are we going to do? As Kansans, we'll all have to be involved. And how we do that, we do not know at this point. We're discussing this at great length. We hope to come up with a solution. And then one of the questions that was posed and talked about earlier was the federal funding. We are hoping to get in line for that. And we have assigned Representative Vaughn to work with the governor's office. And we in the legislature will work also to push for people to get involved and pressure our federal counterparts to share that money with us. We have the evidence now. We have all the information. And to put that in writing and share that with our federal folks will be fairly easy. It'll be a big task, but we have to do it if we expect to get any of those funds. It'll be a lot of work, but it'll be worth it if we choose and want to, and everybody does, to enable our state to move forward both economically and with the population we have. If not, it'll be sad. The outmigration will increase.
Yeah, and thank you for really expanding on the topic of infrastructure. I might delve into this a little bit before I will go back to the question of equity in just a second. But for infrastructure, you know, they're talking about the major infrastructure bill at the federal level right now. You guys think there's any chance that some of those funds will come to projects in Kansas? You know, we've heard a little bit about that with the water injection dredge at Tuttle, and we may talk about that with our solutions portion of the commentary, but what do you guys think about that?
Yes, I saw that bill just passed last night. And so we have an infrastructure bill headed for presidential signature. And we're hopeful, as Chairman Highland said, of those dollars being meaningfully and well spent and substantially spent on projects in Kansas. The one that you mentioned, which helps address the water supply issue for our part of the state here in Johnson County and all through the Northeast, the Kansas River watershed, the water injection dredging pilot project. There's a pilot project that we hope to get funding for to operate in cooperation with the Corps of Engineers on Tuttle Creek Lake that will help suspend sediment and safely move it downstream in a way that doesn't do any harm downstream, but helps to restore capacity in the reservoir. With traditional dredging to create capacity, that was done in the John Redmond Reservoir at great cost. And unfortunately, just digging the sediment out and putting it somewhere else is only a temporary fix because it will just fill back in again. And it's not really, it's just not economically feasible to do traditional dredging. So I'm hopeful that this bill that just passed, we have had requests in, and a number of partners have been doing the work and communications that they can to try and request some of this infrastructure money for the water injection dredge, which we affectionately call the WID. And hopefully, as Dawn was referring to, that some of that money will go to help improve these aging infrastructures that really do impact the impact at the worst, in the worst way, the communities that can least afford it. So that kind of circles back to your equity question, but I am hopeful that the new infrastructure money will help address some of that.
Rep Vaughn, could I give just a little, I want to give a little education piece just for those that live, I think a lot of people live in Johnson County area. So, you know, the way that water is provided on the Kansas River to the Johnson County area is through those 4 major reservoirs, in addition to the rain that falls. So you've got Milford Reservoir, Tuttle Creek Reservoir, Perry Reservoir, and Clinton Reservoir. Those 4 reservoirs release water, flood waters. They hold water in times of flood, but then they release it into the Kansas River. But Tuttle Creek has a really special job, and part of that is to provide flows in times of drought for the Kansas River. So there are target flows on the Kansas River, and so these reservoirs release water to meet those minimum stream flows so that all the users downstream can get the water that they need. And so these reservoirs are critical for 2 things, really. The big 2 things are to hold floodwaters back, right? Because we built all of our communities along the river to get water. And now our communities, you know, have to be protected from the floodwaters. But the second piece is they provide water in times of drought. So when we talk about why is it so important that we fix our reservoirs so that we have more capacity in them, this is the reason why, because we need them for both floodwaters and for downstream water use. Thank you.
Excellent. And I do want to let our panelists know we have about 10 minutes left for this portion of the event. So let's see here. So, you know, Connie, to kind of complete this portion of the program, I know we've had some questions about water rights as well. So would you be willing to just briefly kind of talk about how the water rights system works in Kansas? You mentioned that it is a property right earlier, and that it has to be applied for, that there are a limited number of these rights, and that they've been over appropriated. But how does the first in time, first in right system work? And could you explain that a little? Because some of our guests may wonder, you know, this system of quote seniority, does that make the most sense? Or does it make the most sense to allot rights based on their what is known as beneficial use? You know, is there a difference between the priority of a right based on whether it's used for agriculture or municipal use or for conservation areas, those sorts of things? So how did we get to where we are? And I know this is a big topic, so we could probably talk about this all day, but kind of how we got to where we are and why that system is or is not effective.
Okay, and I promise I will not take up the whole 10 minutes. Okay, so water rights 101, go. The Kansas water law, Kansas, as we've talked about, the eastern side has much more precipitation, much more stream flow, rivers, those kind of resources. Western Kansas is more arid, more like a desert. Most of the water comes from underground. Initially, Kansas, our water law patterned the eastern United States, which was based on water flowing down a stream and how do you allocate that fairly. In 1945, the legislature, there was a monstrous study that was done and a complete set of laws was adopted that we follow today that patterned after the Western United States. And that is called prior appropriation. What that says is first in time is first in right. It was patterned after the old mining laws in the 1800s, where it's very pro-development. Okay, the mindset was there's gold out there, there are, precious things that you can dig up, and we want people digging them up, and we want economies booming from it. So it was an encouraging development thing. And it said, you go out, you stake a claim, you work it, it's yours. You were there first. Now, if you walk away, then maybe somebody else can move in and get it. You have an ongoing obligation to keep, to work it if you want it to stay yours. In general, that's what happened with the 1945 Water Appropriation Act. We said first in time is first in right. So there's a permitting system, which in the mid-70s became a requirement. It wasn't actually required until the mid-70s, but we now have a permitting system where, again, if you're anything but domestic, you have to file an application and get permission, whether you're a city or an irrigator or for recreation or you name it. Most of Kansas is closed to new appropriations. As we said, it's over appropriated. There's more spoken for than the system can supply. So in many, many areas, you can no longer get a new one. The first in time, first in right is a key here though, because the law does not care if you are irrigation, if you are industrial, if you are municipal. It's where is your place in line? And it's designed such that in time, it's based on the idea that there will be times of shortage. That's the whole point of the prior appropriation doctrine. So when times of shortage arrive, the person with the oldest right gets it. So there's a process in place where now, if you have an older water right than someone near you and suddenly you can't pump as much, then you call the Division of Water Resources. They investigate if there's actually a causal relationship. Then by law, they can shut off the newer people until you have yours. That worked really pretty well with stream flow. It's a lot trickier when you're talking about groundwater. And so we're running into those kind of issues now with management because of course there isn't enough to go around. But a lot of people don't understand that, why does this particular activity get to use water and have a better water right than this particular activity? Do we want to value municipal over ag? Do we want to value ag over municipal? Does that matter in different parts of the state? Well, the way our laws are set up right now, it's a non-issue. It's not even a question. It's where are you in your place in line? So I think that's probably where I ought to stop talking. Does that answer your question, Lindsay? Is that enough of a 101?
Yes, I think that was great. And if our audience does have more questions about how water rights work, we're going to have a Q&A portion of this event around 10. We want to get to some of the solutions first here, but feel free to put those questions into the chat box and we'll make sure that we get those answered. But I think that was an excellent 101. So thank you for sharing that, Connie. And with that, we will get into the second portion of this event. And I know we're running pretty tight on time here. So I will try and summarize some of the solutions that we've already talked about and then ask the panelists to kind of expand on some of the questions that we have before us. So just to recap, in terms of solutions to our issues of quantity, Dawn talked about the LEMA, which is the Local Enhanced Management Area. And that can be used to have a community come together and agree on conservation goals for their community in order to reduce the amount of groundwater that they use in their farming calendar year. So that's one solution. That's similar to things you may hear of IGUCAs, and someone will have to remind me of what that stands for, and then water conservation areas, or WCAs, as well. So solutions exist for this method of conservation. And then in terms of reservoirs with quantity, we've talked about the water injection dredge, which can help remove sediment from the bottom of a reservoir, and which is currently a project that is being piloted and partially implemented by the Army Corps of Engineers. And then we did get a question in the chat about preventing the sedimentation of reservoirs and doing that through sediment management of streams, or what's known as stream bank stabilization. So with that, I will kind of open it up if you guys want to recap these solutions. But what I really want to highlight is that solutions exist. This is not a problem that, we're still searching for those solutions. It's a situation where we know steps that we can take, and we really need to focus on how do we get those implemented. And that's a big task of the House Water Committee going into this next session. So I'll kind of open it up to panelists. Do you have concluding thoughts about solutions to water conservation and management in Kansas? And then would love to talk to Chairman Highland about what is the Water Committee doing to make sure these things get implemented.
I'll start off. Thank you for that question and that recap. There are many programs that the state and the federal government, and also a lot of nonprofits. We often don't talk about the role of nonprofits, but you think about organizations like Ducks Unlimited and Pheasants Forever and Sun, the Nature Conservancy, and some of these organizations, they also have what we call best management practice programs that landowners can work with them to implement conservation measures on their property. I would like to just highlight a little bit about nature-based solutions, where we're seeing more of that happening also throughout the watershed. One of the things that's really promising in Western Kansas is the addition of playas. And playas are just small indentions in a field where water will collect. And what some of the research has shown is that when those playas dry up and they have cracks around the edges, that when it rains, they actually recharge the aquifer at a pretty decent rate. So there's a workshop coming up in January out in Dodge City, and I'll be there for that, where we're going to learn more about the role of playas to recharge aquifers. There's also wetlands. Wetlands can filter pollutants out before they make it back into our water supply, and also opportunities to reconnect our rivers to their floodplains and use some of those nature-based solutions to, hold back water in times of drought and to hold floodwaters as well. So there's a lot of opportunities for us to do things like that. And again, I'm going to chime in with the adding green space into our cities and really slowing down the water as it comes off the landscape and makes its way into our rivers, I think is another really good solution. And there are some cities that are doing some really progressive things in Kansas. If you're interested, I'm sure there's a lot of great information out there, but we're already doing some good things, but I think we could do more.
And Dawn, we got a quick follow-up question there in the chat. Some interest in wetlands, and I think maybe during the Q&A portion, we'll get into the Quivira National Wildlife Reserve. But we had a question about artificial wetlands. You talked about their importance in the ecosystem of water in Kansas. Are there any efforts to implement artificial wetlands in order to enhance those good side effects?
I think there are some projects happening across the state. I'm probably not going to be able to speak directly about any one of those, but for example, there's a program this is one that I think is a really great opportunity. there's a nonprofit called Kansas Alliance for Wetlands and Streams, and they work with Kansas Department of Health and Environment on a program called Water Restoration and Protection Strategy. Basically, it's the RAPS program, that's what we call it, but the program works with landowners to install conservation practices to protect water quality. One of the really neat things that they're doing in the Clinton Lake Reservoir watershed is they're working with the city of Lawrence to work on the wetlands above the reservoir and to use the city and CAUSE are working together with KDHE to try and slow down the sedimentation of Clinton Reservoir and also to filter all of that water coming off the watershed before it goes into the drinking water supply for Clinton Lake. If you're familiar, if you're from Lawrence, then you know that there's two drinking water supplies, the surface water of the Kansas River and then Clinton Reservoir. So Clinton Reservoir is critical to drinking water supply for pretty much Douglas County and the city of Lawrence. So that's a really great project to highlight.
Thank you for that response. And so we've heard about many of these solutions. Mr. Chair, what are ways that the committee is hoping to further the implementation of these or address these issues going into next session?
Well, first we have to understand that we have now discussed the gloom and doom, and now we are working on the positive side. How are we going to work on this issue? And some view the legislature as an evil body, and others think we do a good job. So we have to balance that. And our committee is committed to doing no harm first. And we have worked with great effort to bring in the experts and listen to them, and also the public. The public has a view in this, and we need to hear all of that. So with that, we will continue to have some hearings and listen to public input. But we have been blessed with very gifted people, Don and Connie and KDHE and the Water Resource Office, to help us along this path. We have to listen. We've done that. And we will, on the legislative side, our effort is to not stop or hinder what is going on out there right now. We only want to help. There are a lot of people all over the state that are working very hard to do their part. Now we need to help that process along. That's our job. And sometimes it means funding. And the funding part is the big gorilla in the room at this point. We hope to get some additional funding from the federal government. The state budget, everybody knows, most of the money goes to education and social programs. And I don't have a problem with that. It's just that there's not much money left over. And if you look at history, the unfunded portion for the water programs has been underfunded from $50 to $90 million, if you look at the estimate. We won't be able to backfill that. There is no money to do that. So we have to figure out ways for the committee, and the whole committee, the process will work. And then we go through the entire legislative process. But everybody should be interested. This is important to our state. We will not survive if we don't continue to get a handle on this. And it's our goal with Representative Vaughn and myself and the rest of the committee. We will be pushing hard on this. We want something to get before the entire legislature this next year. So it's important. We're working hard on it, and we will do our best to figure out ways to help the situation and not get in the way of future development. The science is catching up, and we need to listen to them and do what we can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. I'm very much looking to the upcoming session. It's going to be a busy one. So to kind of wrap up this portion, we've talked a little bit about solutions and how funding is really critical to that. So, what are ways that we can all work together to make sure that these issues get addressed? Whether that's what are action steps that the league members can take, or what are things that are on the horizon that we can all do to get involved and make a difference with water in Kansas. I'm going to open this up to all of our panelists here.
Well, I'm going to chime in just real quickly, and then I'm going to pass it over to the master advocate, which is Dawn. Of course, it's such cliche, but contact your state legislators. They need to know that this is on your mind and this is critical. This is an election year, and I imagine that your legislators will be listening even more intently than they usually do. So I support Chairman Highland's work and Representative Vaughn's work and the entire committee. I'm glad that they're taking this issue on in whatever way, you know, they propose to go forward. I'm glad it's getting visibility and energy, and that they are listening to the science and saying we really need to get some funding, and we really need to pay attention, because these are things that we absolutely have to deal with. The alternative is not good, so it will only be more expensive and more difficult. So with that, in terms of what can people do, I'm going to hand that over to Dawn without taking up all the time myself.
It's a really great question, and there are lots of ways that you can get involved. First, I'd like to just make sure that you all understand that the state water plan is supposed to be statutorily funded at $8 million, and that has not happened since 2008. However, I will say that the last few years, we have been very grateful to the legislature for increasing that funding. So we're getting a lot closer. So one of the things that you can do is talk to your legislator about fully funding the state water plan. I've heard, over the years, I've talked to lots of legislators, and mostly with, my role with Friends of the Caw, and they often, don't hear from people about water. I mean, there's a lot of things that they're trying to work on, and there are a lot of issues at play. So I think it's really important that they hear that water is important to you. If you're interested in funding water and you're interested in us doing more for water, they need to hear that. They need to know that you're interested in that. The second piece is, we didn't talk about this today, but as part of the Kansas Water Authority and the greater water vision for the state, there are 14 regional advisory committees. And these are all volunteers that are on these regional advisory committees, and they're throughout the state. You can go to the Water Office website and see a map of all of those committees. What they're charged with is coming up with goals and action plans that are relevant to their part of the state, to their watershed, or to their piece of where they live. So they are really the experts who know what the regional issues are, what the local issues are. So those are public meetings. Find out where your regional advisory committee is. And for those of you that live in Johnson County, it's the Kansas Regional Advisory Committee, which I spent 6 years on that committee, and it's very near and dear to me. Great group of people working on really tough issues. So join that conversation. There are often openings for all of those regional advisory committees. Volunteer, join the conversation. And then the last piece of this is there are lots of organizations like Friends of the Caw, the Nature Conservancy, the Sierra Club, Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever. There's lots of nonprofits working to help get the conversation also rolling on water. Lend a hand. Maybe you can participate in some way in something that you can do to help also. So, and then the last thing, and this is one that I think is the most important, talk to your friends and family. Talk to those in your circle about water and let them know what you've learned today, and encourage them as well to continue the conversation. Go to work and talk about water around the water cooler. It's a perfect place to talk about it. So I just encourage you all to help us elevate the conversation.
Excellent. Thank you, Dawn and Connie. And I would love to chime in here just a little bit too. And that is just to say that I love Connie's recommendation of reaching out to your representatives and senators. We love to hear from you, and this will be an important issue in the coming session. And on top of that, we are hoping to have opportunities for public comment in the coming session. So really encourage you to think about, what are your top issues for water quality and quantity in Kansas? And we encourage you to come and share that with our committee, so that as we craft legislation and really start to prioritize what that will look like, that your voice is part of that. So that's my plug for our committee as well. And I just want to open it up. Do we have any final thoughts from panelists before we do some audience Q&A here? Mr. Chair?
So Vaughn, I need to let people know that you are involved in what we are calling at the committee level, the public awareness campaign. And this goes along with what Don and Connie both said. We are aware that unless we get public awareness on this, we will not get the backing through the legislature. So we're working hard on that. And Lindsay is working on print that we will put out to all the newspapers, 2 or 3 items that we will send out to increase this public awareness. In addition to that, she and I both are speaking at different conferences between now and next January. I personally, well, the both of us have the one where we're going to talk to the water conservation group. That's in November 22nd. And on the 17th, I will be speaking to the Kansas Livestock Association, their water committee. And then on the 17th in the afternoon, both Lindsay and I will be talking in the governor's water conference. I think that's been established. But so we are doing what we can as often as we can. At every meeting I speak about water. Engineers meeting, I don't care. Every one of them I go to, I talk about water. And the word is getting out, but we need everybody's help on this. Talk to your neighbors, whatever, talk to your legislator. If you have friends in Western Kansas, please talk to them. Everybody needs to be aware that it is a situation we need to deal with. And with that, I'll get off my soapbox.
Lindsay, if I could chime in for a moment.
Yeah, go for it, Connie.
In terms of people educating themselves and being engaged and involved, the Governor's Conference on Water is coming up November 17, as you and Chairman Highland will be among our speakers. The Kansas Water Office and the Kansas Water Authority sponsor this conference. It is virtual this year, which is unfortunate, but the fortunate part is it's free. So you can and you can register, and the first day we have some terrific plenary speakers. The first day is only in the afternoon. The second day is only in the morning. You won't be stuck on your screen all day long. And there are breakout sessions on the second day. Information about this is at the Kansas Water Office website. And I believe the League of Women Voters will be sharing the link for that in a follow-up email. You can also go to the Kansas Water Office website and find that yourself. We're also in the process of updating the Kansas Water Plan, which identifies all issues, recommendations, input from the regional advisory committees that Dawn mentioned. It's a monstrous undertaking, big document. You can take a look at the draft that's posted again on the Kansas Water Office website. If you want to inform yourself in a quick and very enjoyable way about what's going on with the Ogallala Aquifer, Lucas Basire's book, it's called Running Out: In Search of Water on the High Plains. He's an anthropologist with family connections. It's a quick read. It's a really good way if you want to understand the issue in a nutshell, in an enjoyable fashion. I would also mention that there are corporate involvement activities and promising things on the horizon with public-private partnerships regarding corporations that want to either claim or actually have some kind of environmental cred. They want carbon credits. There's a new article that just came out in The Guardian about corporations pledging to be water positive. And so these entities want to be able to establish that they are green to some extent. And there are even investment scales that now that rate them on these things. So consumer demand is driving this. What that means for Kansas is these corporations help in pilot projects that we have now infuse cash for farmers to do some of these more soil health initiatives and change their practices, use less water. It's improving water quality. It's helping with water supply. So these public-private partnerships are also another exciting thing coming up in the future. And I kind of wanted to throw that in there before we were done. So I'll be quiet.
Thank you so much for sharing all those fabulous resources. I know it seems like we have a lot of people in this forum who are really interested in water issues. So I think those are some great additional items that you can take a look at if you really want to delve into this. I've also read Running Out by Luc Bessier and loved it. So highly recommend that. And with that, I think we will go ahead and dive into some audience Q&A. And people have been sending their questions throughout the program, so we'll go back and answer some of those. But for anyone in the audience who has not submitted a question and has something they'd like to ask, we encourage you to just type your question in the chat box, and then we will do the best we can to get to all of them. We have Q&A through about 10:30, so just over 10 minutes of Q&A here. And I will get started with a question from Kay. And early on, we talked about how many water agencies deal with water issues in Kansas, namely 16 in the state, and then more at the federal level. So are there any discussions, or do you think there would be any benefit to consolidating quality and quantity agencies specifically in order to more efficiently manage water in Kansas? And I'll open that one up to anyone.
I'll jump in here so that no one else gets put on the spot. I don't think there's any need to do that. They both function very well. We want to keep them separate. They both have different missions, different jobs to do. And no, we are not going to consolidate those offices. That would actually impair the movement forward. That's not something as the committee chair I'm interested in doing. We're only looking at funding, number one, and number two, if there is any movement, it will be to organize so that it's better usable by the public, both information and actual action. So I'm against that.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. All right, next, we got some great questions from Elaine, and she wondered, first, we'll just start with the Quivira National Wildlife Reserve. Connie, do you maybe want to give an overview of what's happening in that area of the state and what the legal implications are for that?
Okay. The Quivira National Wildlife Refuge is that it's quite a long-term problem. It's an area that's been over-appropriated for decades. And the Quivira National Wildlife Refuge does have a very senior, very old water right for the refuge. And so in a nutshell, dilemma has been how to supply the refuge with the water it needs and is entitled to under its property right, with the surrounding water users, which are largely irrigators, some municipalities, I believe, and domestics. But if you absolutely strictly follow prior appropriation, where you shut off the newest one in order, one by one by one by one, until the senior has enough, economically, that's pretty catastrophic for the area. So there have been efforts over years to try to come up with some kind of negotiated solution. And the Water Office is not involved in that. This is with the Division of Water Resources, the permitting agency, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, which has the refuge. And there is a local groundwater management district, groundwater management district number 5 that's in the region. And of course, people that live there. There have been efforts to try to find a negotiated solution. There were efforts to try to develop a LIMA, where they had a locally driven plan, and that did not end up being successful. So there was a lawsuit filed to force the state agency, the chief engineer of the Division of Water Resources, there was a federal lawsuit filed to force the Fish and Wildlife Service to say, yes, we want our senior water right enforced, and chief engineer, you're required by statute to enforce that. So do what you got to do. just recently, within the last week or two, the federal court dismissed that on jurisdictional grounds. So I'm not sure what's going next, but there are efforts ongoing to try to negotiate some kind of outcome that wouldn't be draconian on the people that live there. But unfortunately, the problem doesn't just go away. And that's not my domain. That's not within my authority to decide what's going to happen. But it does get back to the problem of over appropriation. And what do you do when people have developed water rights and livelihoods over time that can no longer be sustained all the same way? So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer, but right now it's sort of, there are efforts going on to try to address the problem. There is a memorandum of understanding that has been drafted between the Groundwater Management District and the Fish and Wildlife Service to try to develop an augmentation program and do some voluntary things to try to address it. We'll have to just see where that leads.
That was great. Thank you, Connie. And while we're talking about legal issues as it relates to water, Elaine also had a question about waters of the U.S. You want to talk about what's being considered with waters of the U.S. under the Clean Water Act and how that affects Kansas?
This gets a little bit outside my lane because the Department of Health Environment is really the lead agency on this particular topic. The agencies are coordinating in terms of messaging with that. What I'm hearing is that this has to do with federal permitting and clean water permitting for particular streamways. Does it affect the tributaries? Does it affect just the main stems? I have to confess that I'm not deeply into that topic, so I really shouldn't probably weigh into this conversation very much, but the state is addressing that. Kansas Department of Health and Environment, in cooperation with the other agencies, are involved in that issue. There is an opportunity right now to develop roundtables for outreach to discuss that. And that's something that we're currently trying to coordinate on to bring in outside voices and community voices on that.
Thank you, Connie, for weighing in. Dawn, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I think I wanted to add a little bit to Elaine's point that she made about, she talked about the minimal stream flows, that they're going to be inadequate as the climate crisis worsens. And one of the things that, this all comes full circle is that as the aquifer, our groundwater drops, so do our stream flows. And those base flows are not the same as they used to be. And then you stack climate crisis on top of that. And so we know that, for example, in the river that flows through, the main river that flows through Johnson County is the Kansas River. But it starts in Junction City where two rivers meet, and that's the Republican River and the Smoky Hill River. Well, those two rivers start in Western Kansas and in Colorado and are greatly impacted by the aquifer and the groundwater. And so it ends up being that what does happen in Western Kansas also affects the eastern side too. So as we're looking at the climate crisis continuing to increase, as those stream flows drop, those also reduce the amount of water that comes into the Johnson County region as well. So, it's one big system. The Kansas River watershed is 61,000 square miles, and it extends into eastern Colorado and central Nebraska. So we also have to be concerned about what happens in those states as well, because it does impact the water in Kansas. So it's a big complex issue, but I will speak to what Connie said. Kansas Department of Health and Environment and Tom Stiles, who is the chief of the Bureau of Water, he understands the Clean Water Act forwards and backwards way better than Connie and I do. And I will tell you that I feel confident that Tom is in the driver's seat, making sure that Kansas is on top of the Clean Water Act.
Wonderful. Thank you both. That was really informative. We have another question about agencies here, so I think I'll turn this one over to Mr. Chair. And the question is, will the Water Committee considering consolidating water agencies? 16 seems like a lot. What do you think, Mr. Chair?
Well, 16 does sound like a lot, but through this process of looking over this massive amount of information, we learned one thing. There are three main agencies dealing with water in our state. And our goal here is to protect those three main agencies. Then you're looking at everything else under that. And we have sat down with all the three heads of those agencies, Connie's one, and we've asked them, is there any way that we can make this simpler, reorganize, if you will, but simpler? And we are working on that process right now. Nothing is in stone or written in ink or anything like that at this point. But our goal here is to make the process simpler for everyone, both the folks within the agencies, but also for all of us out that are users of water. If we have questions and we need help with something. So it's being looked at, nothing yet to share.
Thank you for that update. We just have 2 more minutes here, so I'm going to do lightning round questions. The first was about urban water issues, and I'll just summarize, but this individual is from Wichita, feels like there's a big focus on rural issues. So does anyone want to talk about urban water issues and why there might be that divide, or that appearance of a divide between urban and rural issues?
I'd be happy to chime in about that a little bit. I think that, yeah, there is always a lot of conversation around rural water issues, but I personally think that the cities are critical to helping us solve a lot of these problems. We have, you know, a lot of impervious surfaces in our cities, and we have a lot of water coming off. And in some places we've built into the floodplain and not allowed our rivers to breathe. And some of our cities are now working on trying to, you know, undo some of that. And so there are a lot of challenges in our big cities along our rivers and streams. And, you know, when we have these really big rain events, for example, I've heard Kansas Department of Health and Environment say that the greatest sediment moves in the 5 biggest rain events in a year. So we're talking 5-inch rains. When we get a 5-inch rain or higher, because I remember one day during 2019 when we had an 11-inch rain, when you have those big rain events, the sediment moves, and so it washes off, and that's when we get these really big flushes of sediment. Well, the sediment also carries nutrients with it. So we have an addition of you know, nitrogen and phosphorus in our water and everything else that comes with it. So the cities, I think, are critical to helping us to slow down this really flashy stormwater that we have happening and putting in buffers to filter our water. And I personally think that we need to elevate the conversation around urban areas, just across the water conversation.
All right, so let's see. It looks like we have time for one more question, even though we've gotten more than that, and they're all excellent questions. I love how engaged you guys are. So we'll ask one more, and then we'll have to turn it over to our wonderful hosts. So our last question is coming from Zach Pastora, and again, this is a water law question. So I will turn it over to Connie, but encourage others to weigh in. And we talked a little bit about the first in time, first in right system. And Zach asks, is it time to prioritize water rights by beneficial use or how the water is used rather than by the date the water rights were granted? For example, could public water needs be considered more critical than private for-profit uses? And might state programs and funding help reconcile that?
Well, this is a bit of a minefield in terms of addressing. I am not going to personally advocate one way or the other, but what I can tell you is if this conversation is going to happen, this conversation would be about changing statute and about changing the fundamental way that our water rights are administered and managed. So my guess would be if someone wanted to really look at the changing how we prioritize water rights, that would be the subject of a very serious and thorough study that you would have to have scientific people, you would have to have legal experts, water rights professors. You would need to really delve into how to go about modifying this system where there are already 35,000 property rights out there, and how to realign those. And would you need compensation if you're going to change people's property rights? And so this would be, if this conversation was to happen, you would need to really address it in a very thorough professional manner. This is the kind of thing that happened in 1945 when they decided to adopt the prior appropriation system. It dramatically changed how water was managed in Kansas. That, who's to say that can't happen again? But like at that time, it was about a 2-year process of really diving into this and coming up with a very thorough study and set of recommendations for the legislature. So that would be how I would answer that question.
Excellent. Thank you, Connie. I do want to ask the panelists if they might be willing to share their contact information in the chat. We did have a lot of wonderful additional questions, so people might be interested in reaching out to you to get those questions answered. Again, not to put you on the spot there, but if you're interested, I encourage you to do so. And I just want to wrap up by saying thank you so much to the League of Women Voters for hosting us. This has been a great opportunity to raise awareness about this issue. And thank you to our panelists for your passion about water in Kansas and for your willingness to come speak with us today. So thank you all, and I will go ahead and turn it back over to Amber to wrap up this event.
Yes, right back at you guys. Thank you, Representative Highland, Don Buehler, Connie Owen, for helping us better understand the challenges and the solutions that are out there and the importance of the issue. And a special thanks to Representative Vaughn for moderating the program and just facilitating such an engaging conversation. I know we all came away with our understanding of what we face. And thank you all for your work on behalf of all of us in the community. We really sincerely appreciate it. So again, our hope for all of you attending is that you will take what you learned today to inform your conversations with your legislators and your decisions at the ballot box. So thank you all again. Have a wonderful Saturday. Next, I'd like to introduce Janine Lenang, who is leading our DEI team along with Kaylee. As you know, our organization has embarked on a mission to become more inclusive and welcoming. And part of this journey involves encouraging people to increase their understanding of equity, diversity, and inclusivity, and examining their own power and privilege. Today, Janine is going to present another DEI moment. Janine, I'll turn it over to you. And Mitchell, if you can share your screen, that would be great.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for the introduction. So we are doing these DEI moments as a way to bring awareness to points or facts that people might not be aware of. And so this one is tied in 2 ways to the discussion today. One is that November is National Native American Heritage Month. And the second is water is a really big deal when it ties to this issue in particular. It's a good thing to keep in mind. So the first point to know is that Native Americans were not considered citizens of the US until 1924, which is when Congress enacted the Indian Citizenship Act, which granted all Native Americans born in the US to citizenship. But because the right to vote is governed by the states, there were states that until 1957, US born Native American could not vote in. If you think about it, when we're talking about water rights and water laws and that discussion happening in the 40s, that kind of representation actually really starts to have a long-term carry forward that impacts current day issues. And it's just not being able to have representation and be at the table for the discussion. The second point to note is that race is a prime indicator of clean access to, or access to clean water. So households in Native American communities are 19 times more likely to lack indoor plumbing than white households. You heard this talked about some with the Kickapoo tribe here in Kansas. The example that I'm actually going to focus on is the Navajo Nation, which about 15% of their households on the reservoir or on the nation do not have access to clean running water. A large part of this is because of about 500 abandoned uranium mines that operated there from 1944 to 1986. And because it is a desert area and because people were having to haul water in, this started gaining a lot of attention in when COVID hit, because hygiene became such a focus, and without clean water, you can't practice a lot of the hygiene, you know, like hand washing in a way that people were talking about to prevent the spread of COVID. The Indian Health Services estimate that it would take about 700 million to get running water to all the households on the Navajo Nation. Now that is one snapshot of one sovereign nation's issues with running water, but they are widespread. It's why you saw protests at Standing Rock for the pipeline crossing the Missouri, because the tribes there were worried about their clean drinking water being impacted. And it is becoming more and more of an issue that's brought up. So those are the DEI moments. I would say going forward, just consider how those two facts interact, how lack of representation until about 1957 possibly affected people's ability to access clean running water in their house. And that's all I have.
Yeah, that was great, Janine. Thank you. It's really eye-opening. And thank you to you and your whole committee for all the work you're doing to keep DEI front and center in what we do.
And I should actually mention, there's going to be a follow-up email after this presentation. And you will actually find more resources if you want to read books, if you want to learn more about Native American culture, particularly in the Kansas City area. We've got links to events going on, and some more in-depth reading if it's something you want to delve into more.
Yes, you've put together a great list of resources. So look for that in the follow-up email. So now just a few announcements. In December, you know, traditionally we've had a holiday party before COVID. We are still not going to do any in-person events in December, but there is discussion about having a virtual happy hour. In the follow-up email, you'll have a question there about whether you'd be interested in attending something like that, and if so, whether you'd like to help organize it. But the next big event for our organization is our member planning meeting. This too will be virtual, like last year, on January 8th. The board is currently working on a strategic plan for the 2022-2025 time period. And at this planning meeting in January, we want to present the draft to members and generate some discussion about where you'd like to see our organization focus in the next few years. So please plan to join us after the new year there. Okay, so next slide, please, Mitchell. And then we have another exciting program in January, a new program for us. It's called the Voter Girl Project. And this is a event in conjunction and partnership with Girl Scouts. And we will be hosting a civics badge workshop for, I think, 3rd, 4th, and 5th grade Girl Scouts. And we are looking for volunteers. It's going to be held at the K-State Extension building in Olathe. So if you're interested in that, you'll see some contact information in the follow-up email. We do need some volunteers to help with this exciting program. It's really fun, I think. So Okay, so next slide, please, Mitchell. And as you all know, work like this workshop and the program like today is only possible because of our members. And on the screen, you'll see two people, Beth Hall and Lori Hill, who joined in October. And we want to thank them and all of you who believe in our mission to build a more perfect democracy. If you'd like to learn more about becoming a member, please contact us through our website, lwvjoco.org, or you can email us at contactus@lwvjoco.org. And before we close, I want to thank Eileen Manza, Victoria Smith, our incredible membership team, as well as Ellen Porter, our social chair, for putting together a warm and fun cider social for more than 50 people and friends recently, members and friends. We are just so very grateful for your persistence and finding a way for us to gather safely together. It's just been such a long time, and it was great to see so many of you. So that's all that we have for today. I hope you guys have a wonderful Saturday, and thank you again for joining us.